Unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversation Series, The Economic Crisis.
Welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation Series on the Economic Crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University. And with us here today, we have Professor Richard Cooper, who is Maurice C. Bose Professor of International Economics at Harvard University. And Professor Cooper is here with us today to speak about the recent unfolding economic crisis and its effect on international trade. So, Professor Cooper, thank you very much for being here with us today. And perhaps as a way to really begin our conversation, a simple question: what are some of the main implications of the crisis on international trade?
Well, in this crisis, international trade or foreign trade has been devastated. It's the first time in nearly 3 decades in which world trade will actually decline in physical terms. There are 2 channels that have influenced trade negatively. The first, which has been very unusual, is last fall a drying up of trade credit. Most international trade actually moves on credit, and when credit is not available, the goods don't move. And we saw last fall a drying up of trade credit in parts of the world, and goods piling up on the docks, not being able to move. Then, as the world moved into economic recession, of course, that you normally get a decline in trade or in the growth of trade during recessions. This is exceptionally deep, and in addition, much trade is in hard goods, and we had a sharp decline in inventories as sellers around the world cut back their stocks as they saw demand falling, and so that gave trade a double whammy.
Mm-hmm. So in essence, you are saying that the liquidity crisis in the midst of which we have been has affected in a very, very negative way international trade.
Right. Now, the trade credit problem was a problem mainly of 6 to 9 months ago. My understanding is that trade credit is reviving. But of course, now we're in the depth of the recession, and so the demand for goods is just way down. So we had the 2 different aspects, both having a negative impact on international trade.
And so what should be done about this loss of international trade? I mean, as a way to somehow reboot it?
Well, the main thing to do is first to be sure that the credit system is working, and that seems to have come back into play. And secondly, we need to get world aggregate demand up. And that's a question of general recovery from the recession. Trade will undoubtedly recover with economic activity, and every major country in the world now has a stimulus package of one kind or another to help, at a minimum, cushion the downturn, and preferably actually to revive economic activity. And I'm confident we'll see international trade revive with economic activity more generally and demand more generally.
Yeah. So the stimulus package is a way to really generate this aggregate demand which you just talked about. But I mean, in a way, what we're also witnessing is protectionist tendencies. So how do we handle...
We've had 2 summits of 20 leading nations of the world, one last November and one in April. And at both summits, the leaders were emphatic that we should avoid protectionism. Protectionism is very attractive in a downturn because the idea is that you divert what limited demand there is from foreign goods to home goods and help employment. But of course, that comes at the expense of some other country.
Yes.
And if every country does it, it actually makes the recession much worse. And I think all of the leading leaders understand that now, and it's the task, the challenge, the political challenge is to execute the pledges that the leaders have properly taken to avoid protectionist actions.
But why is it politically tempting to go for protectionism in times of crisis?
Demand for automobiles, to be very concrete, is way down, and people will naturally ask, why should Americans be allowed to buy Japanese automobiles when they can buy American automobiles, and that will create employment in the United States. And so that's a politically attractive but naive argument. But it is politically attractive. And as I said, the leaders understand that, in fact, that argument does not generalize. If everyone does it, everyone is worse off. And so they understand that there's a system issue and not just what's happening at the local automobile plant. And but that's the dilemma that protectionism poses. It seems attractive to people in the short run to generate employment at home, but of course at somebody else's expense, and if they're behaving in the same way, that cuts down our employment in some other factory.
And so this applies across the board, both for developing countries and for developed countries?
Absolutely.
So tell us
Same
a bit
argument.
about so tell us a bit what about, for instance, the cost and benefits of the cost and benefits of protectionism, for instance, for developing countries.
Well, there is an issue of what developing countries is too big a category for me to find useful.
Okay.
But if one takes concretely China, for example, which is it is definitely a developing country in the sense that it's been growing rapidly for 2 decades, but it's still a low-income country by comparison with the United States or Europe or Japan. And Chinese can tell themselves or ask themselves, why should we be importing this equipment and inputs from Korea and Japan when we can make them at home? We could deal with our unemployment problem by protecting against imports from these other countries. But of course, the reasoning also applies in reverse. Why should we in Japan or in Korea be importing clothing and toys and electronic products from China when we can make them at home and we could create employment at home? This is a very, what economists call micro thinking. But of course, we all engage in it in our everyday lives. And it's the job of leaders to address what I would call the adding up problem. And if you take it all together, it doesn't add up. And you end up with the Japanese having, in my particular example, more employment in their electronics industry, but much less in their equipment industry, for example. And China have somewhat more employment in the equipment industry, but much, much less in the electronics industry. And both countries are actually worse off once you take into account the generalization of this way of thinking.
And how does this apply to developing countries, which are mainly resource-rich countries? I mean, countries which are really in the business of exporting resources. I mean, how does it apply to them?
Well, I mean, if you take the extreme case of a country that exports only resources or primary products, the possibility for employment generation at home through protection is actually very, very limited. And the main protection that we've observed in recent years in resource-rich countries is limitations on exports in periods of very high demand, such as we had in late 2007. Food prices were going up. A number of countries limited the exports of food products. Of course, that created more problems for other countries, the importing countries. That is not the situation today. We don't see any temptation to restrict exports today. given the weak demand, except in the OPEC countries. They have a formal agreement on restricting oil exports, even in today's circumstances.
You mentioned earlier so that countries do agree on the fact that there is a need to really go against protectionism. So what have been the specific measures taken in the context of the current crisis to really make sure that we don't go down this path? I mean,
this is one of those examples of negative policy. It's mainly avoiding actions that might otherwise be taken. So the leaders following their no protection pledge have to say no to lots of proposals that are coming up through the political system from business firms, from labor groups, from legislators. And so it's being willing to say no and make it stick. And we know the World Bank has been keeping records on this. We know that the no protection pledge has not been respected universally. There are examples here and there of countries that have violated the pledge of their leaders. For example, Russia this spring imposed much higher tariffs on imported cars. And Mr. Putin, the prime minister, received an earful from Russians in the far eastern part of Russia because they get their cars, mainly used cars, from Korea and Japan. And this made life much harder for them. So that the problem with protection is that there are, it benefits some people, but many more people typically lose. And if the voices of those who it benefits are too strong in the political system, mistakes are made from the overall point of view.
What has been the situation in the European Union? What has been the position of the European Union on the matter?
Well, again, at the level of the leaders, and in the case of Europe, one had leaders of a number of individual countries and also the president of the European Commission present at these G20 meetings, and they all signed on to the pledge. So they're all at the level of principle. They're all in agreement. No protectionist actions. Of course, there are protectionist pressures in Europe, as there are in the United States. I just mentioned Russia and many other countries under circumstances of weak aggregate demand, such as we now have.
But I mean, one of the issues which is always talked about is how do we make sure that liberalized trade even out global income distributions and even promote equality. So if liberalized trade is really a good thing and is the goal, how do we make sure that it becomes an engine for global income distribution and promotion of equality, especially in times of crisis?
Well, I guess I'm not one of those who shares the objective of equality. The objective I have in mind is move everyone out of poverty so they have real choices in life and let rewards respond to effort. And since the effort is not always equal, I think equality of income is actually a mistake, but what we've actually observed over the last 1 and 2 decades is growing it's a paradox, growing inequality within many, indeed most countries, certainly within the United States, within China, within India, in combination with less inequality at the global level. Now, how can that be, one can ask? Growing inequality everywhere and still less inequality at the global level. And the answer, when you think about it, is relatively simple, which is some very important poor countries, most notably China and India, but including many others, are growing faster than the rich countries. So that although inequality is growing within India and within China, those countries are growing more rapidly than the United States and Europe, not to mention Japan, and therefore world inequality has been diminished, and actually markedly diminished in the last couple of decades. But we're not talking now about the recession. We're talking about longer
Yes.
run trends.
But I mean, precisely, do you think that the recession is, what is the impact of the recession on this trend that you just pointed out? I mean, is it worsening thing? Is it also an occasion, or is it an occasion for us to try to really, perhaps, reverse these trends?
Well, my own view is that the trend toward greater global equality, combined with increased inequality within countries, is intimately related to international trade. China could not have grown nearly as much as it did. India could not have grown as much as it did during the last 15 to 20 years without engaging in an intimate way with the world economy, which China did, embraced the world economy, India more cautiously and more tentatively, but increasingly embracing the world economy. And it has served both of those countries very, very well. I think if we were to see a major reversion to protectionism, especially in the, well, worldwide, but especially in Europe and the United States, this would cut off a channel of prosperity which is open to most countries of the world. And so I think that would have a very negative effect if, in the context of the recession, we saw a major increase in protectionist responses, which will not go away quickly. That could greatly weaken and, in the limited case, even reverse this trend which we've actually observed of rapid growth in countries that started out 2 decades ago as very poor countries.
So in essence, I'm trying to understand, you are saying that global trade has contributed to reduce inequalities at the global level. But at the same time, with global trade, we have witnessed within developing countries growing inequalities, right?
That is correct. And I would be less confident about linking the growing equality within countries to international trade. But as a general observation, when new opportunities are created, and they can be created in many ways, by new technologies, by more international trade, by changes in policies, when new opportunities are created, some people are either better able or by luck better situated to take advantage of the new opportunities than other people are. And so we see the impact of any new opportunities, the initial impact is typically to make some people better off relative to others. Now, over time, the new possibilities get diffused more widely. But the initial impact is to, particularly if one started with widespread poverty, for example, the initial impact of any change is to reduce the poverty, but to increase the inequality, because some people are more able to take advantage of it. But one has to take a long-term view of these matters, and again, I draw on China just because it's a spectacular example. This has been the biggest, China's engagement with the world economy has been the biggest anti-poverty program in the history of mankind. Depending on exactly how one measures poverty, between 250 and 450 million people have moved out of poverty in the last 2 decades. And for the first time, they have real choices in life for themselves and their children. So I think this, from a global point of view, is an extremely positive development. But one must acknowledge that there are still many people in China who live in poverty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not everyone has been engaged in the same degree. Tens of millions of people have been engaged, but not the entire population yet. We need another 2 decades for that. So there's one has to have, as I say, a long-term view of these questions. But the developments we've seen in the last 10 years, I think, can only be described as fabulous from the point of view of reducing poverty around the world.
So on the long term, global trade has a positive impact on global inequalities within. So in order to have this positive impact, I mean, do we need to have along the way policy changes both at the global level and at the national level when it comes to trade? To capture this positive impact, along the way, do we need specific policies to make global trade having a positive impact on equality issues within developing countries?
Well, again, I don't. I'm less interested than you are in equality within countries.
Yeah.
I'm. It seems to me the challenge at the moment is to avoid a reversion to protectionism, avoiding sliding back. So preserve the system that we have, and then as the opportunities permit, move it forward. And there, of course, the main item on the agenda is the Doha round, which has been a major round of multilateral trade, further multilateral trade liberalization, the ninth in a long series of such liberalizations. It's been stalled. It's been stalled largely over, depending on whom you talk to, each one blames the other for the reason stalling. But I think we ought to seize the opportunity when the opportunity arises to move it forward and result in a further liberalization of trade. I don't want to suggest that trade is the only vehicle for promoting growth, or that the possibilities of trade by themselves will always promote growth. What I want to suggest is that for all but the very biggest countries, and I would say even for them, even for the United States, trade is a strong facilitator of growth. Engagement in the world economy is actually a necessary condition to keep competitive pressure on businessmen and entrepreneurs everywhere to keep their costs down and their quality up. And most countries, in fact, are just too small in aggregate economic terms to grow for more than a few years without engagement with the world economy. So this is a necessary condition. It's been a feature of the world during the last half century, and we've seen one country after another move from poverty to prosperity. People forget now that 50 years ago, Japan was a poor country. Italy was a poor country. Spain was a poor country. Korea was a very poor country. These countries have moved into, in the case of the first ones I've mentioned, they're now rich countries. And there are many more countries in an intermediate status that were desperately poor 50 years ago. And so we are actually doing something right, taking the big picture. We are doing something right. And poverty in the world today, around the world, is much, much lower than it was 50 years ago.
You just mentioned a minute ago the Doha trade round negotiations. Why is it so difficult to find an agreement? Because you mentioned that negotiations have been stalled for quite a while. Why is it so difficult?
Well, every round, this now is one of many that we've had, and every round that I'm aware of has had its period of being stalled. This one's a little longer than some of the earlier ones, and they're stalled because countries see themselves as not getting everything that they want, and they see themselves as having to give up things that at least some of the constituents at home don't want to give up. And so this is really a question, it's basically a political challenge of negotiating a deal which is acceptable to everyone. And I think that this is just at this very moment is probably not the best time to revive it. But as the world economy picks up a little bit, I would take advantage of the pickup to give the Doha round another push. One of the problematic areas is agriculture. And many countries around the world, not every country, but many countries around the world, rich and poor, feel they have to protect agriculture. and the protection even went up during the period of sharp price rises of 18 months ago. So we have to overcome that barrier. I think that free trade in agricultural products is not in the cards in the near future, but that's not being requested either in the Doha round. Just some liberalization of trade, which I think could be structured to benefit publics in every country.
Why is it so difficult to achieve free trade when it comes to agriculture? Why is such a focus on agriculture? Why is it so difficult to really achieve free trade when it comes to agricultural products?
I think there are two quite different reasons. Eating is a necessity for all of us, and so every country has either in the back of its collective mind or even explicitly a concern with food security. So countries do not want to see their, even though it may be cheaper to import basic foods from elsewhere in the world, they don't want to see agriculture disappear altogether. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is, remember that when we were all poor, we were all farmers. Only a small, thin upper crust of aristocrats and warriors, rulers, were not farmers. Almost all of it. Everyone in the world has a background. If you go far enough back, in my case, you only have to go back one generation. We're farmers, and fundamentally, development is moving people out of agriculture into more productive activities. But making change is hard in life, and to move people out of agriculture before they're ready, before there are clearly better opportunities outside of agriculture, is a political challenge in every country. The one major exception to what I've said historically was Great Britain, which made a strategic decision 160 years ago, in the 1840s, to move to free trade in agriculture and depend on imported foodstuffs. But of course, Britain had political connections with very productive agricultural areas, such as Canada, such as Australia. It had close commercial ties with the United States and with Argentina, and it had a powerful navy. So Britain was, but it was a strategic decision on Britain's part. It's interesting to look at Japan today. Japan is a very rich country, extensively engaged in trade, but they still have a strong residual concern for agriculture, partly on food security grounds, partly on mitigating human change grounds. And then, of course, other factors get thrown in. Culture gets thrown in. Environment gets thrown in. In my view, most of those are pseudo-arguments. They are arguments that are piled on top of the basic reasons why countries protect our agriculture. So it's a challenge. The challenge, it seems to me, is nobody proposes moving at once to free trade in agriculture, although we've done that now within Europe, in the European Union. It took a long time, but it was done, and within the North American Free Trade Area, which involves Mexico, Canada, and the United States. We now have agreed in principle, if not always in complete, smooth operation, free trade in agriculture in those two important regions of the world. So I see this as a trend in the world economy at large, but it's a trend that can be paced at a rate at which countries can accept.
So you are saying that to this day, agriculture continues to be part of the DNA, if you will, of societies. And you are right in a way. My grandfather was a farmer, so you don't have to go very far to really find this agricultural route. So you're absolutely right. Perhaps a last question to end our conversation. A few weeks ago, you gave a testimony in front of the U.S. House Armed Services Committee, and you talked about I think it was in March 2009. You talk about the implication of the recession on U.S. national security, and you talked about the loss of confidence in U.S. competence. So can you talk a bit about this issue, because I thought it was an interesting comment and remark.
Well, I think I start with the presumption, which you, being from France, or others could challenge, that whatever people around the world think about Americans, and some like Americans and some don't like Americans, and some make distinctions of the things they like and don't like, the general impression was that Americans are competent. They know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And we've had several examples in the last decade which have raised serious questions about such an assumption. I think the only way to describe whatever you think about the war in Iraq in 2003, the combat phase of the war was managed by Americans skillfully, successfully. The post-combat phase was bungled. Mm-hmm. Is the only way to describe it. It was just bungled. It showed the total lack of preparedness and competence in execution. And then we did not do too well. We had a big hurricane that hit one of our major cities, New Orleans, and again there was an issue of the first the emergency response, and then secondly the recovery, neither of which showed a very high degree of competence. And now comes this financial crisis, mm-hmm. which we've had financial crises at least once a decade. In my view, it's part of normal development. Mm-hmm. But this financial crisis unambiguously started in the United States. Mm-hmm. And raises serious questions, and the American financial system has been held up around the world as the center of capitalism and a well-working financial system. People may not like the outcome, but mm-hmm. they admired the competence, the skill with which it was managed. Now with the what we started as the subprime mortgage crisis, unambiguously started in the United States and gradually spread to other parts of the world, raises serious questions about American competence in managing this essential feature of the American economy, namely the financial sector. And so if I were sitting anywhere around the world, Americans, I have to say, did not have such a high view of the universal American competence, because we live in the United States. We see many examples of incompetence. Mm-hmm. But if you're sitting in a remote part of the world, this has got to raise serious questions about the competence of the United States, and that in turn, I think, will translate into greater skepticism. Mm-hmm. About advice from the United States, guidance from the United States, and so forth. It may be overcome in time, particularly if the United States restores an impression of competence by coming out of the recession quickly mm-hmm. and securely. That will undo part of the damage. Mm-hmm. So it's not, I would say, irreparable. But I think that at the present moment, the willingness to use the United States as a template, mm-hmm. as I heard from Chinese officials not so long ago, they said they've lost their template mm-hmm. With this financial crisis. And I suspect that sentiment is echoed in many parts of the world.
So, in fact, what is also at stake in the management of this crisis is precisely the reputation of the U.S. So, are you confident that the current management of the crisis is going to contribute to re-establish a good image when it comes to U.S. reputation, U.S. sense of competence?
Well, am I confident that will happen? No. Mm-hmm. We live, I think, in exceptional uncertainty. in this recovery. At least in my view, you can't be confident about any particular outcome. But I would give the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, high marks for its behavior in the crisis starting already in 2007. It's moved way outside its traditional boundaries, self-imposed boundaries of behavior, but I think the situation called for it. Mm-hmm. And I would give the Obama administration, of course, it's only been in office a few months, but I think that they've handled things quite well. They moved a stimulus package forward very quickly once they got into office. We lost 2 to 3 months because of the peculiarities of our electoral system between an election and a new government. But the new government moved, I think, very quickly. The big uncertainty is how rapidly the financial community will return to normalcy and begin lending, particularly to small and medium-sized business, and that remains to be seen. I think the indications at the moment are good. The financial market seems to have recovered. The economic indicators suggest we may hit bottom in the coming months in the recession. So the indicators are good, but one cannot say what will happen with any high degree of certainty at all.
And so you don't think that the fact that there is such a huge public debt now in the U.S. is a problem for the U.S. or for global trade in general?
I think of framing policy in terms of feasible alternatives and choices among feasible alternatives. Mm-hmm. And my view about the growing public debt of the United States is that it is the least bad of the various alternatives. So am I happy about it? No, but I would be less happy with all of the alternatives that I can imagine. So it's the least bad of the feasible alternatives. And yes, there will have to be an exit strategy. The Federal Reserve will have to, as the economy returns to normal, the Federal Reserve will have to unwind, withdraw a lot of the liquidity that's put into the system. I know they're thinking about that as we speak. And the longer-term strategy is that the American fiscal situation will need a major correction, but not too soon. Not too soon. Only after the recovery occurs. And I guess the only other comment I would make is that in this particular set of circumstances, many other countries are in the same situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
because
we're seeing budget deficits having risen sharply from, say, 2 years ago, right around the world.
Because while reading your recent testimony, I mean, I was thinking about the geopolitics of the public debt, because one has to think, once again, I'm not a specialist, but one has to think that having a huge public debt must have implications on the ability of a country to conduct public policies at home, but also abroad. So there is a geopolitical dimension to this issue of public debt.
Yes, I would not disagree with that. Only to say that on the path we're on now, I think it's actually manageable, but it needs to be managed. I mean, to say it's manageable is not the same as saying it's in the bag. It needs to be carefully managed, and there's no doubt in my mind that with the tremendous growth of debt, not only here but in Japan and Germany and Britain and so forth, governments 3 or 4 years from now are going to be more constrained than they otherwise would be in the expenditures that they're willing to undertake. I think that's a highly plausible forecast to make as a consequence of the current developments. Yes.
Professor Cooper, thank you really for your time. We have reached the end of our conversation. Professor Richard Cooper is Moritz Sibo as Professor of International Economics at Harvard University, and we were having this conversation in the context of the upcoming conference on the economic crisis and its impact on development. So, Professor Cooper, really thank you for your time and your insights. Thank you.